In Quebec, we walked away from religion controlling our lives in the 60s. This unique moment in history is called the Quiet Revolution. With the radicalization of the Christian evangelical world in the States and Canada, I wanted to learn and know more about how that compares to Quebec, and whether there truly is a difference between this religious right and the rise of the right wing. I also wanted to know whether this interesting movement affected Quebec at all. In that spirit, I invited Pastor Benjamin Peltz, also known as my brother, onto the show to dive into a topic that has shocked and appalled many of us since 2016. I was curious to hear an evangelical's take on the extremism that has now taken a hold of the Christian evangelical world. Could you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, Bachelor of Politics from Trent University, a Master of Theological Studies, and a Doctor of Ministry in Ministry Leadership. I am a pastor at a church at Curve Lake First Nation, and I'm a chaplain at Trent University, where I did my Bachelor of Politics. Mm-hmm. And currently, I'm the interim director of Kawartha Youth Unlimited, which is an evangelical youth ministry that I've volunteered with in the past and pastored a lot of the staff of. It's not an organization I've been super connected to historically, but right now I'm helping them in a time of transition, and it's interesting to compare that to my experiences in other spheres. Mm-hmm.
I want to get right into it. We'll start off with a nice hardball. Let's be real. The Christian world in Canada, and especially the States, has been radicalized to the right. And so what factors do you think are driving the radicalization of certain Christian communities towards far-right ideologies?
Yeah. So I guess I should give a little bit more of my personal context because it shapes the way that I think about these questions.
Absolutely.
I grew up primarily in Ottawa, Ontario, which is the capital of Canada, and have spent most of my adult life in Peterborough, Ontario, which is about 3 hours west of Canada, and grew up as a Canadian evangelical Christian. And a lot of my adult life and work within the church has been spent unpacking that experience and trying to understand what was good from it and what wasn't so good from it. And there's been a lot of shift in my own thinking. I would say that it's fair to say that I've become more progressive over time rather than more conservative in the way that I think about my faith and social engagement. And so for me, it's interesting to see how that trend has often moved in the opposite direction for people like me who are in the evangelical church. As you said, there's a tendency for many of the people in my churches or from my community that I grew up in that have become more radical in terms of the right-wing side of things, lining up behind figures like Donald Trump, saying this is the kind of person that we see as our representative, which seems strange to me because one of the things I cherish from my background is that there was always an emphasis on the character, the moral integrity of the person that was leading. And it seems like that's less and less of a concern, and more the concern is simply whether or not the leader is going to force through changes that suit our particular political tribe. I think this is part of a larger tendency within our society where politics is actually filling the vacuum that religion once held within our society. And in some ways, I actually think it's a spillover effect of things like the Quiet Revolution that took place within Quebec. I'm not as familiar with the Quebec religious scene, but the studies that I've done have shown that in North America, the 1960s and 70s were a time of massive transformation in terms of the religious landscape of our society in general. And this has taken a few generations to trickle down. But in brief, baby boomers became a lot less attached to traditional forms of religion and began to engage in a more consumeristic version of religion. And then Gen Xers and millennials became less attached to even that much religion and more likely to be skeptical of the church and religious institutions overall. And increasingly, younger generations, Gen Zs and Alphas, are not being raised within the church and are looking for some other source to give them a sense of value, a sense of connection, a sense of purpose in life. And politics is increasingly the area where you see that taking place. I think for a lot of people, their political engagement and identity is the most important aspect of their life, and their religious identity or spiritual identity is less important in terms of how they engage in their public identity formation and engagement with society around them. And I see this on both the left and the right of the political spectrum. It seems like polarization is the norm of the day. And I think people who are in churches are often encouraged to make their politics the main thing, whichever side of the political spectrum they tend to fall on. And you see a lot of religious institutions being pulled apart because of that, because traditionally religion has been a moderating influence when it comes to political ideologies. So I think that it's kind of this overall trend that is taking place. And then when it comes to evangelicals specifically, I think because of that polarization, so much of the dominant narrative that they have is an us versus them narrative, which says that progressive people are the bad guys who are forcing changes on our society that we do not want. And there's a myriad of changes that fall under that category, from immigration levels and racial changes, as well as social issues like abortion or LGBTQ issues, and even the decline of the church itself. Often there's this perception that that's some sort of intentional project on the part of people on the left side of the political spectrum. And they see those changes as being a political machination of those on the left. And their response is to go to the extreme opposite and resist and combat every single change that they see as being from the left side of the political spectrum. And I think as soon as you do that, as soon as you see things in terms of good versus evil, right versus wrong, us versus them, that pushes you to extremes that don't happen if you tend to have a more universalizing narrative, like the one that I would tend to have, which is that we are all human beings made with dignity by a creator, who are struggling with the implications of human evil, and the way that that has affected the world. And nobody is either pure evil or pure good, but we are all caught in the tug of war between those two forces within our lives.
Right. How has this change in, as you said, this change in how we view religion, this change in how we interact with politics, how has this changed the political landscape in Canada and the US? Let's focus more on Canada, that being said.
Sure, yeah. And so, again, I'm speaking from my own experience and my own studies. One of the things you see for sure is less attachment to religious institutions. And so, just numerically, fewer and fewer people across generations are likely to attend church on a regular basis or to conform to some sort of standard given by a denomination or a religious tradition in terms of what they should believe and what they should practice. They tend to be a lot more independent in how they form their spiritual and religious identity. And they tend to have a mix of different influences. So they will draw on other religious traditions that are outside of Christianity, or they will pick and choose different ideas from teachers of religion that they might have encountered through books, through YouTube videos, through TikTok videos, things like that. So I think there's a move towards a more individualistic kind of spirituality as the norm within our society. And again, when you look at it across generations, there's some changes in terms of how that shapes their politics. Among older generations that are more reticent about the changes going on, there tends to be a pull towards the more conservative, reactionary, we don't want these changes, and lining up behind conservative political figures. And you see that in the United States in a really pronounced way. In Canada, you don't see it quite as pronounced. There's not as much of a cult of personality around certain individuals, but you do see that conservative, older, evangelical Christians or things like that are more likely to vote for Pierre Poilievre in the upcoming election, or to vote for other figures on what we would consider to be the extreme right of Canada's political landscape, whereas you get younger generations who are less attached to those norms and traditions, and they tend to be more likely to vote for the NDP or to the Green Party and swing to the left side of the political spectrum. And you see the Liberal Party actually wrestling with this a lot right now. They used to be the norm within Canada in a big way, and increasingly their share of the electorate that is committed to the Liberal, the more moderate way of doing things, is shrinking. And I don't think they've really found a party identity that goes beyond that. I think that Justin Trudeau represents a lot of the changes and the tensions around how to handle that within the modern Liberal Party.
Right. Something that we've seen in Quebec is this anti-immigration sentiment People
Yes.
are very angry at the existence of immigrants in Quebec, regardless of where they're from. If you are not white, except for Europeans who are immigrants, just throwing it out there, guys. That's an immigrant is somebody who's moved here from another place. But it's specifically about skin tone. So
Right.
you see a lot of people reacting to that in Quebec. And this is a general thing that is occurring on the right, and especially the Christian right. Do you see this happening due to the church? Do you see the church pushing against this? Is it encouraging this narrative? What do you think about that?
Well, so again, I think the cause and effect is maybe flipped a little bit.
Okay.
One of the trends I'm tracking right now with is that it seems like religious labels are strangely enough becoming more important to younger conservatives in recent years. And there maybe is even a reversal in the trend of how many people are willing to identify as Christian within the youngest cohorts of our society right now, because of the way that political conservatives are increasingly clinging to religious labels in order to describe their political identity. So the term evangelical in the United States is actually, when you test for religiosity, there does not seem to be nearly as strong a connection as there used to be. The term evangelical used to be primarily a religious label. In the United States, it's increasingly becoming a political label. And
Interesting.
I think,
so people are using now almost this religious term as a political label.
yes, that's right. And so the same thing is true when it comes to this idea of being a Christian nation. That's an idea that has always been there and raised evangelical. There was a lingering idea, even in Canada, we're a Christian nation. But increasingly, I think the idea of being a Christian nation is not so much about trying to inculcate a certain religious worldview in people. That's not the primary concern. We need to make sure everybody adheres to Christian doctrines. What it is it's more of a nationalistic identity. I identify as somebody from a Western European heritage who has inherited a set of ideas and values that come from that Western European heritage. And I want my country to look a lot more like people that I identify with instead of people that I don't identify with. The impulse is I don't like the changes I see, the number of people coming from other parts of the world who are visibly different and practice their life in a way that's notably different from my own. And when people look for how do I frame this, then what they get is there's a handful of people who are capitalizing on these divisions and saying what you really are looking for is a Christian nation. And I don't actually think when I look at what people are saying that looks like, most of the time it's not about the religion at all. It's about wanting to go back to some idyllic past in which we feel like people like us are the norm. And that's more of I think a political impulse rather than a religious one. Although you can never fully separate the two things. That's one of the changes I've gone through, is realizing politics and religion go hand in hand.
They do, yes, of course.
But I think
did that idyllic past ever exist?
No, but certainly I think that it is true that there was more natural overlap in terms of the experiences of people in the past within our society rather than what we are dealing with today. The differences between groups was smaller, and so those differences were more noticeable. So a good example would be the Catholic-Protestant divide. Catholics historically in North America have been a bit of a marginalized people group. They've been a smaller portion of the society, and white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have tended to view them as the bad guys. And in a place like where I live in Peterborough, the Catholics were kind of pushed into communities on the margins of the urban center because of the fact that they were not viewed as reputable and as desirable within our region because they're Catholic. Nowadays, white Christian nationalists are actually much more likely to embrace Catholics. It's really interesting. White evangelicals are saying we like Catholics because they share our social values. The difference between Catholic and Protestant seems smaller when you're comparing yourself to a Hindu than it does when you're comparing different branches of Christianity. I think the world in which white European Christians were seen as the norm within our society was not an idyllic past. There was a lot of strife, a lot of contestation between those groups, and in fact, often more violence between those groups than what we see in pluralistic societies where there's lots of racial minorities present. But I think that this monoculture well, certainly there was more of a monoculture at some point in the past, and people today who don't like the diversification of our society are grabbing onto that without recognizing how bad some of the circumstances of people were within that monoculture.
Do you think Jesus was a far-right guy?
No, I think that most of the work that Jesus did as a religious and political activist is in a vein that we would call progressive, although these labels are a little hard to work with when you're dealing with ancient phenomena.
Yeah, this is an antiquity that we're talking about.
We're talking 2,000 years ago, incredibly different in terms of the norms of the day. But for me, studying Jesus's life and teachings has really helped me grapple with some of the political issues of my own time. I think the reason why I would say that we would call him more progressive is because a lot of his work was spent challenging the institutional powers of his day. He rejected some of the social and cultural narratives that religious leaders of his time had, and often his accusation towards them was that they were complicit in the power structures of their day, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were linking themselves too closely with the Roman authorities, and that in linking themselves to the Roman authorities in this way, they had become part of the establishment in a problematic way, right?
Yeah.
And he was challenging that and pushing for a more equitable society in which people who had been marginalized would be treated with dignity. And that impulse in particular, in our society, social justice tends to be seen as a concern more of the left than of the right. And social justice was integral to everything that Jesus was doing. But within that, one of the things I recognize and I think I would agree with, that I like about Jesus's approach to things, is that he also resisted what we might call the radical left or something like that. That there were groups of Jewish people in Jesus's day who saw the proper response to that corrupt power structure as being violent revolution, where they just wanted to overthrow the empire and do whatever was necessary to try and get rid of that power structure. And what's interesting about Jesus' teaching is he says we need to overthrow the power structure, but the way that we do that is through loving people, through caring for people, through treating everyone with dignity, instead of trying to use violence and coercion to bring about the change that we desire. And in that sense, his approach was not what people would associate with a more extreme version of progressive politics. You see throughout much of the 20th century, communist revolutions or things like that. I also don't think Jesus would have been in support of that kind of thing. In fact, I think a lot of his work was spent trying to teach an alternative to that revolutionary way of bringing about progressive changes within his own culture.
So what you're saying is that Jesus wouldn't want the guillotine.
Right. He wouldn't want the guillotine. That's kind of revolutionary impulse is not what Jesus is motivated by. Instead, he calls people to a radical kind of love that is not individualistic. I think this is one of the things I've had to challenge my own upbringing, is I tended to think of it as long as every individual is good and kind towards other people, everything will just go well. Now I realize it's more complicated than that. We live in social structures that advantage certain people and disadvantage other people, and we need to be able to think through and challenge those social structures. But I think that what he says is that the way we engage in systemic justice is primarily by creating countercultural communities that treat people better than the society around us. And that if we can do that, that will lead to the kind of systemic change that we yearn for. I think that's a lot of what Jesus was in the business of doing within his own social context.
I've noticed, along with this radicalization towards the right in the evangelical world, there also is a tendency to reject science. And I've noticed there is a correlation between anti-scientific thinking and far-right ideology. Is this because of Christianity? Do you think Christianity supports anti-scientific thinking? Because in Quebec, we have a higher value for intellectualism. It's a very French way of thinking. We have inherited that from the French. And so I think that is one of the reasons we tend to reject religious thinking.
Right.
But do you think that is do you think that is true of religion necessarily, or do you think that is kind of maybe a thing that's happening politically as opposed to religiously?
I have a complicated relationship with the term Christianity because, as somebody who
Okay.
both has been a Christian his whole life and spent most of my time within the church and therefore very much part of Christianity, I've also worked with a lot of people groups who have been hurt by Christianity and have tried to understand Christian history in as nuanced a fashion as possible. So when you say, is this inherent to Christianity? I would say that most of our society is shaped by some form of Christianity. And the question is, what form of Christianity are we talking about? Anti-scientific thinking is very much baked into North American evangelicalism, which is the dominant strain of conservative Christianity within the United States and to some degree in Canada, not as large a share of Canada's political scene, but it is very much, and that goes right back to the what is called the fundamentalist modernist divide, in which there was a number of major denominations in the United States that had embraced scientific thinking and integrated it into their academy and their theological teaching. And there was a conservative backlash against that tendency among many major denominations to accept modern scientific ideas. And they basically began to frame their identity in terms of being everything other than what those progressive denominations were teaching, right?
Their identity became a response as opposed to its own individual thing.
That's right, yeah. And so in the late 1800s, this movement emerges called fundamentalism, which is the predecessor to a lot of modern American evangelicalism. And the identity was, they embrace science, we reject science. They embrace complex theology, we reject complex theology.
Right. What has the role of the church been traditionally in society, and has it prevented us from progressing?
Again, the church, like Christianity, complex term. I think that ever since somewhere around the time of Constantine in the 300s AD, there has been a version of Christianity, which we call the church, which has been very closely linked with the political powers of Western European society. And so the church has often played a role in stabilizing the norms of the day and educating people to be good citizens and encouraging people to pay homage to the political leaders and to be good citizens, participants within the political system. And not all of that is a bad thing, of course. We like living in a relatively orderly society, and especially for certain periods of time, like in the Middle Ages, the church played a really important role in something like giving people a basic education that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. The church was the educational vehicle by which things like literature were actually sustained. But within the church, because of that proximity to power, often there is a corrupt strain that tends to hoard power and to abuse that power in order to favor certain people. And there's always been revolutionary movements within the church that have said, that's not the way of Jesus. We need to push back against that. And they are often at the forefront of innovation at both societally as well as sometimes scientifically and things like that, trying to push for new ways of thinking, new ways of being that challenge the status quo. In the Roman Catholic Church, often that's been in the monastic movement. Monks and nuns have often had a role in revitalizing the church when it has become too atrophied and too corrupt. Within my own tradition, Protestant evangelicalism, often it's been in what we call the parachurch world, which is missions agencies or small movements within churches, revivalistic movements, things like that, that often come with a social justice edge that challenges the entrenched norms of the day. A good example would be evangelicals actually played a really important role in abolishing the slave trade within Britain, but it was kind of a subset of the religious establishment of the day that was responsible for that. And so you could say the church was part of propagating slavery, but you could also say the church was part of abolishing slavery. And that's a lot of the history of Western European society. That's right. Yeah.
In that vein, do you think the church has a role to play today, especially with its diminishing importance in daily life?
I think that Christianity has a lot to say about the kind of questions that people are asking these days. I think people are yearning for a sense of belonging because we are a very lonely culture with how detached we have become from each other. I think people are searching for a sense of purpose. What should be the driving passions of my life, and how can I live a fulfilled, satisfied life? And this is something that religion and Christianity specifically have a lot to teach about. I think there are questions about the fundamental things that should hold a society together, and what are the core values that we should share with one another. And Christianity has historically built tight-knit communities that have a shared sense of identity. So there's a lot of these things that I think Christianity plays a role in, or at least Christian teaching plays a role in. I think the church, if we define church simply as Christians coming together to think about those kind of questions, I think absolutely has a role within our society moving forward. And I see a lot of the younger people and the marginalized people that I work with as being very interested in that kind of Christianity, that kind of church. Home churches where people just gather inside of a house and they eat together and they pray together and they talk about life issues together. That's actually something that's growing. There's a lot of excitement around that model of doing church today. But when it comes to the more established church, things like the Roman Catholic Church or evangelical megachurches, I think most of the signs show that those forms of church are declining and will likely play a diminished role in our society moving forward. I suspect there will always be some form of institutional Christianity within our society, but I think those forms are changing rapidly, and I'm not sure right now what the outcome of those changes will be. It could be a little bit more like home churches that are networked together rather than large-scale institutions that control billions of dollars worth of property and other wealth. I think that is something that we are probably going to see less of moving forward. And honestly, I think that may be for the good of society in general, because I don't really think Jesus and Paul and the other early Christians had that kind of thing in mind when they were trying to talk about what it is that makes for a good life and what true religion looks like.
Right. Just out of curiosity, do you not think that everything that you just described could be fulfilled by any religion? Or like some major societal movement? I don't know, like a lot of people are doing stuff like that in the LGBT community. They have a huge amount of community stuff like that
Yes.
gives people that sort of support. So do you not think that could be fulfilled by any institution or community group like that?
I do think that a lot of the things people are yearning for can be fulfilled by other institutions, other ways of forming community. Absolutely, I do. One of the things that's interesting for me as I've unpacked my Christianity is that I think sometimes we have mistakenly believed we have a monopoly on that which is good or true. And I don't actually think that the Bible, Jesus, Paul teach that. When you look at the Bible, every part of it, there are signs that true spirituality, true religion is found beyond the particular people group that are writing the Bible or are directly in mind with the biblical text. And actually, often what you see if you look at the biblical story is that God is challenging the people that he's speaking to recognize the inherent value of the people who they don't identify with, right? So this is a major theme all throughout Scripture, is that there's a tendency within human beings to think, I am the only one who understands the true nature of the universe, God, the good life, religion, whatever we want to call that thing. And we have a tendency to see everybody else as the bad guy, the people who are against us. And over again, we see, here's the foreigner who's in your midst, and actually I'm with them, not with the person oppressing them. Here is the priest from another nation who actually worships more truly than the priest within my own nation. Here is the Greek who gets Jesus better than the Jewish person, which in Jesus' day was a pretty radical teaching. So yes, I think there is a lot of goodness within non-Christian religions, within non-Christian communities, within groups that would not identify as Christian or maybe even push back against Christianity as it exists. But I think that for me, part of the reason why I can see that and part of the reason why I cherish that, part of the reason why that's a big part of my own framework is because of the fact that I've studied Jesus and his teachings. I've studied the Bible thoroughly, and I think it teaches us that that's where God is to be found, is in certain common truths that make human beings capable of thriving, whereas the temptation towards other ways of being, including this us versus them framework, is something that human beings are tempted towards that is destructive. So my Christian faith informs how I view all of those social dynamics. I don't know if that makes sense, if there's more questions to clarify that, but yeah.
I'd like to, I'm going to push back some more if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
With all of that you just said, like, it sounds very positive the way you frame it. Oh, it's this community, it's supportive, except people are leaving the evangelical church in droves. And the Catholic Church, frankly, in Quebec is more or less dead. In Europe is essentially, it exists, it will exist forever. It is technically, like, often a state church. In various countries, such as the Scandinavian countries, Lutheranism is the state religion. In Quebec, it's traditionally viewed French Canadian Catholics, right? That doesn't exist. And now that's happening over the rest of North America. If this thing you're proposing, this community, this support, is supposed to exist, why are people leaving in droves? A silent exodus. We're seeing this quiet revolution throughout the rest of the world now. Maybe not the rest of the world, the rest of the Western world. I want to be clear. I'm not experienced with parts of the world I've never lived in.
Sure. Again, I'd actually gently push back against that a little bit.
Please. That's why I threw it at you.
So I think the trend for the last 60 years within our society has been to move away from institutionalized forms of religion. And again, I actually think on some level, maybe that's a good thing, because I don't believe a state church is what Jesus had in mind in terms of the kind of community that he was trying to cultivate. That being said, one of the things that actually does scare me a little, which is the starting point of some of our discussion here, is that I think there's a portion of our society that is yearning for a return to the state church model. And that's what Christian nationalism is.
Interesting.
We want to resist the changes we see going on in our society politically by doubling down on a model that I think has not served people well throughout the centuries. We want to go back to identifying as an explicitly Christian country. We want to codify religion into our society again by implementing things like the 10 Commandments in Scripture or the Lord's Prayer in schools. The 10 Commandments in schools, the Lord's Prayer in schools. And we want to even maybe have more overt religious tests for our political officials and stuff. Even in Quebec, right? There's this kind of weird double nature to some of the changes going on within Quebec, where they're banning religious symbols, which seems like it's getting rid of religion, but a lot of that is in the vein of protecting the Quebec identity as a French and Catholic society, not a Muslim society. And that's something that people outside of Quebec are like, wow, we see the fact that this is largely motivated by anti-Muslim sentiment, right?
It's pretty clear.
That's right.
It's pretty clear.
It's pretty clear. And that's something that feels strange for people in central Ontario, where our tendency is to say the government shouldn't be interfering in people's personal religious life. They should be creating a secular state that allows people to choose which religion they want to follow and get along with that, as long as they're not disrupting other people too much, right? Whereas there's an increasing tendency, no, we want to have some sort of state intervention to enforce a set of values and national identity that stems from, even if it's not overtly religious, it stems from that state church model of religion, right? Now, I suspect that a lot of that is just the dying throes of something, and that maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to see that backlash has largely petered out because it's not going to be successful. I think so far, most Western institutions are shutting down that attempt to create state churches. But there is a lot of anxiety right now, for example, in the United States around this. I'm trying to remember what the the label is the
Project 2025.
That's it. Yeah, the 20. I was trying to think of the numbers. Project
Yeah,
2025.
Project 2025.
Right?
Yeah.
So that thing that is very much trying to create a state church, and there's fear among more progressive people who believe in this project of secularism, that if Donald Trump gets reelected, he's going to actually go along with this, and there's going to be a lot of legal changes that make Christianity favored again in the United States in a way that has been diminishing over the last 60 years or so. So yeah, I think I'd push back against the idea that there's no impulse towards that within our society, even though I think that likely that will pass away as baby boomers pass away and as some of the legal barriers to those changes continue to assert themselves and the energy dies down from that. But again, what my experience has largely been with people who are not part of the established church. They aren't in state churches. They aren't in big, powerful mega churches that are swaying the politics of their city. It's tended to be in smaller places. My church has only 25 people in it. They're a mixture of First Nation and settler people. And in that setting, I get to see the good side of the church. And the people who are part of it are there because they really, truly benefit from it, and they see the benefits of it for their community, the way that we build loving community around the values of Jesus. And similarly, my work at the university in Peterborough is with young adults who often are struggling with the Christianity that they were raised with, and recognizing that the way that their Christianity assumed certain realities in terms of social structures and power structures and things like that, that was unhealthy. But they still love Jesus, and they still want to follow his way of life because they see how much goodness is there. And so I work with a group of 30 plus students where they are just trying to, in their university life, care for each other and care for their fellow students in a way that reflects their Christian values. I think there's still a lot of energy in that. I think that people who are like that have always actually made up a relatively small portion of our society. When you look at much of Western European history, the statistics that we have based on what limited studies we've got, as well as other documents that people have tried to track, shows that those who are highly motivated by the religion have always been a relatively small portion of the society. But I think those are the people who have often been the force for good within their society. Although, again, when they're too powerful and they are motivated by religious power, that's where you see the tension. I think a lot of our society has been shaped by engaged religious people who are using that as a means to power, and engaged religious people who are using that as a vehicle for positive change. And I think that's going to continue to be the case, and Christianity will be a big part of that within Western European societies and its offshoots.
As a political theorist and pastor, as you are, why do you think the Christian national world, the right, is afraid of significant change? What brings that fear to them? Why is that something that particularly people who are in these Christian circles fear?
I think that the most conscious part of that, if you were to ask most of them, they would say they believe the changes we are going through are harmful to people. And I really do believe that for most people, their conscious motivation is good. They would say that the changed sexual norms in our society are likely to harm young people. They would say that something like abortion is really killing babies. And they believe that to their core, and therefore believe that's a social ill that is harming people, the babies themselves and the people committing abortions. I think when it comes to the immigration and some of those things that we're talking about, that's a little bit more complex, but they would say it's hurting people economically. I'm not sure that that's borne out by the actual numbers, but that's one of the narratives that people have, as well as one of the increasing narratives is that it's introducing a lot of crime and drugs and things like that to our society. Again, not sure that's as borne out by the numbers as they claim, but they would say these are things that are harming people. It is bad to have people trafficking drugs into the country alongside their immigration here, right? And so I think that's the most conscious motivation, is they really believe society is getting worse and worse over time, and that it's having a direct negative impact on people's lives. That being said, as I've unpacked these narratives in my own heart and in the communities that I'm working with, I do believe that a lot of it is more about power than people are consciously aware of.
Right. Yeah.
I think that
Patriarchy, man.
that's right. There's layers of this. This is the intersectionality
Mm-hmm.
stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men have had a huge amount of power within our society, and the changes that are taking place genuinely challenge that by
Right.
introducing other people to powerful circles, and sometimes by actually interrupting the power structures of the society. And an example of that would be the way that churches are declining. And if you benefited from churches being a really powerful institution within our society, it feels threatening to have the church declining. Whereas if you're somebody like my First Nations friends at Curve Lake, who tended to be on the negative receiving end of those
Right.
power structures, they tend to be okay with the church declining. They're like, that's not a bad thing. Now people like me have more space to exist in our society, right?
Right.
So I think that's definitely there. I think it's not the conscious justification for it. People are mostly motivated by fear because they see what they believe to be negative impacts on other people. Maybe a good example of this would be in the Paris Olympics, the whole thing around Imane Khalif. I don't know how much you were tracking with that, but this
Oh,
idea,
I've been tracking it.
yeah, I figured likely, right? But I had a number of friends who were posting on social media decrying how the Olympics were allowing a man to beat up a woman with no regard whatsoever for the complexities of that particular situation. Right? And I believe them. I tend to think when people tell you who they are, you have to believe them to some degree.
When
I
someone says
believe
who they are, you believe them. That's the
that's
rule,
right.
man.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I believe when they say, I'm terrified of a world in which men are beating up women professionally, I'm like, well, okay. I believe that's
Probably
what's
true.
going through your brain right now.
At least on like a deeply conscious level.
Yeah.
Like if there's something underneath that, they don't know it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. They're not fully aware of, at least. Yes, it's about the conscious awareness piece. I think human beings are narrative creatures. We are deeply shaped by our understanding of the nature of the world, what it has been, what it is, where it is going. Again, that's actually, I think, a big part of religion is helping people to form and challenge narratives about the nature of the world. And I think a lot of the conservative evangelical narrative is our society was good and is getting much worse, and I'm terrified of what the future looks like in that changing world. That is the conscious driver of so much of conservative reactionary radicalism.
Mm-hmm. I can see a lot of, even among, because in Quebec, again, very irreligious, I can see a lot of correlation between, because right now we have for Quebec, a conservative government for Quebec. We still have the highest tax rate in North America, for example. But like, but for Quebec, we have a pretty conservative government. And you can see a lot of similarities between how the Christian right thinks and just how people are thinking in a rural community. You can see a lot of parallels between that thinking, and it's pretty interesting to examine under the microscope.
Yeah.
When it comes to major social debates, obviously the church has people within Christianity have a lot of influence within themselves. So somebody says, oh, I don't like this. Somebody else within the church might listen to that person. But do you think there is still a role for Christianity to have power and or influence within politics on a grander scale outside of the Christian church?
So I think that until our society has radically changed, institutional Christianity will have some role simply because of the fact that it is so involved in the power structures of our society.
Right.
So in the United States, evangelicals still are a major voting bloc that can sway elections and therefore will have some role to play in that. I don't know if that's what you're talking about, though. I think you're talking about the more movement-oriented Christianity that I've been describing. And
yes, that is what I'm talking about.
I think that will have an important role to play, but it will probably have a lot less formal power and a lot more movement nature to it, is the way that I see that playing out. in particular, I think Christianity has an important role to play in terms of the idea of being peacemakers. I think as our society fragments, we see an increasing tendency for people to vilify those who are different than themselves. And that includes these conservative evangelicals that we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation. And I think when I look at the way of Jesus and what he teaches we ought to be doing, I think there's an important role in walking the path of peacemaking, where when we encounter people who are different than us, we begin by listening to understand and then doing our best to identify common ground that we can relate to them on, and using that as an opportunity to challenge and to get people to revisit the way that they are living in relation to the people around them. And this focus on challenging in a loving manner is something that shapes the movements that have been most influential in my own thinking these days. I think one that I've had the opportunity in the last year to learn a lot more about is the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and his fellow leaders. And they were explicitly motivated by their understanding of Christianity. And they teach non-violent social action to this day. And I had an opportunity to actually visit a center in Selma where I got to learn a little bit about that way of engaging in social action. And I think that is going to be increasingly relevant in a society where political tribes, political groups are vying for power over the other. And I think as Christians, to get to a place where we say, that's not our goal. Our goal is not to gain power over the other, but rather to really build a society in which we can all flourish, is going to be increasingly relevant, is going to be increasingly hard to come by. That's not everybody. Again, you said there are other social movements that are committed to that, and I believe that. But I also think that increasingly the movement of our society is towards wanting more power over the government so that we can enforce the changes that we see as desirable. And small Christian communities have a role to play in challenging that impulse and creating common good movements towards justice.
Mm-hmm. Now, you work a lot within First Nations communities, and I would like to know how, because we have one of the largest First Nations communities in Quebec and British Columbia, where I've spent about half my life now. I've spent between out there, and I think British Columbia is the largest First Nations community in the country. Except maybe the territories, but the territories are so small that I'm actually pretty sure British Columbia wins just by sheer population. Nonetheless, I'd like to know how that has impacted your community, Christianity in general. How has that impacted your community? How do they perceive it as a general whole? Because there are those who are within your church community, but those who are not within your church communities, how do they perceive your group, the Christian group, in that community?
So I've worked with 3 First Nation communities pretty extensively. 2 are in northern Quebec, Mistissini and Nemska. Both
you spent summer after summer after summer in northern Quebec, right? So it's Quebec running is a huge camps. Part of your life.
That's right. And then over the last 5 years, I've been pastoring this church at Curve Lake First Nation, which is just about half an hour outside of Peterborough, which is about an hour and a half north of Toronto, for those who don't know the area very well. And what's been interesting for me to see is how different the relationship to Christianity is between those communities. And as I've studied Indigenous history more broadly, I've seen that's true, that the history of Christianity and First Nations people varies quite a bit from place to place, from region to region.
Interesting.
So in the northern Quebec communities, their experience is very much shaped by the things that we talk about in terms of Indigenous history in our country. They were first met by traders who came primarily to build trading relationships and seem to have had a relatively good experience with those traders and formed close relationships with those traders. But then over time, through things like residential schools and forced adoptions, Western European life was thrust on them in an abusive way and left a lot of people with trauma to a degree that I think intergenerational trauma really does shape the life of those communities in a big way.
Huge, man. Yeah.
And at the same time, what's interesting is that for those communities in the 60s and 70s, a big part of the healing process for a couple of generations was evangelical missionaries from Baptist and Pentecostal backgrounds who came to those communities and shared a different version of Christianity than they had experienced within the residential school system. And the focus was on this idea that through Jesus, you can forgive the people who have hurt you, and you can be forgiven for any ways that you've hurt another person. And a whole generation of Cree people found that to be a healing message. And they are committed to that message. And I'd say among people who are 50 and older within those James Bay Cree communities, they, like, maybe 70 or 80% of those people would identify as Christian. And what they mean by Christian is some variation of Pentecostalism and Baptist Christianity.
Okay.
And you see these revival meetings that take place in the summertime, and the whole community goes out to these meetings because that's such a central part of their spirituality. Most of them don't engage regularly with church services on a Sunday morning, but nonetheless, they would identify as Christian. They would believe that message that I just shared about Jesus forgiving and helping us to forgive. And they've tried to pass that on to younger generations. Younger generations are a little more reticent about that because of the fact that they see how even that has a colonial edge to it, especially the way that often they were told they had to abandon a lot of their native practices and instead take on this evangelical version of Christianity. The younger generations are saying, we want to re-engage with our indigenous values and maybe even some of our religious ceremonies and things like that. But often they too would still identify as Christian, partly because they have parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles who have been good role models for them of overcoming the trauma that they've gone through. So often in the camps that I was helping run, we had a lot of young people who had already converted to Christianity at some point in their life. And what they were trying to figure out is, what does that mean for me as a First Nation person? What parts of my cultural identity can I reclaim and integrate into my Christian identity that's been the foundational piece of my life? Curve Lake is very different than that. Curve Lake, because it's so close to a number of white communities, actually didn't have a lot of residential schools engagement. There wasn't a lot of people taken from their community and sent to residential schools.
They're right outside of Toronto.
That's right.
It's they were the densest part of Canada.
That's right. They were generally actually just integrated into our school system. And that came with its own kind of abuse, but it was a subtler kind of abuse. It was a lot more of feeling estranged and alienated within
ostracized.
Their schools. Ostracized, that's right. A lot of social pressures, things like that. And in the day school, there was sometimes abuses. There was a day school right at Curve Lake First Nation, and there's been some uncovering of that in recent years. But because they weren't taken away from their parents, they were still living at home, and they were a little more integrated into their community. It doesn't come with quite the jarring nature that came with the residential school system. Forced adoptions affected more, but even then, often that was kind of more like a child welfare sort of thing, because often interventions were able to happen in a less aggressive way. When it came to people who were just struggling in the school system, it was, we'll just get them connected to a guidance counselor or a counselor or something like that, instead of it having to always be an adoption out of the community, which, again, was really a factor in the northern communities more than the more southern communities, right? So these things that are there. Some people are residential school survivors in Curve Lake. Some people were forcibly adopted out of Curve Lake and have come back to the community and tried to figure out what to do with that history. But a lot of the thing that they have faced is actually a less entrenched power structure of Christianity. Most of the Christianity there is Methodism that came alongside just general circuit ministry that people were doing in the area. And a lot of the Christians that I know in the community are just like, this is part of our community, not because it was forced on us, but because we saw something here that was desirable to us. We chose to become Christian. And for probably 3 or 4 generations, Methodism was one of the most dominant elements of their religious scene. In recent decades, they've been able to reclaim more of their native identity, and things like the powwow, which were outlawed for a number of years, have now become a common practice. But even in that, they've actually had a more positive experience than a lot of the northern communities, in part because of Trent University, the school that I'm a chaplain at. they've actually tried hard to work with First Nations people and to celebrate their heritage and even to invite them to come teach settlers about their culture. And so a good portion of Curve Lake as a community is employed teaching Indigenous ways of being to white people. That's actually a big part of their economy, is teaching at Trent University or teaching in public schools or going and leading cultural celebrations and ceremonies at public events in Peterborough, in Lakefield, in Buckhorn, and some of the towns that are surrounding Curve Lake. And so I know a number of young people that's their job, is they get invited to go to church celebrations where they teach about their culture, right? And so there's a little bit more of an integrationist mindset at Curve Lake, where a lot of people assume you can be both Christian and overtly practice your First Nations traditions and teachings. And the question is, at what point do those things come into conflict with each other? And that's where you see the most tensions, is that some people think you should lean more into the traditional teachings of Indigenous people, and other people think you should lean more into the Christian side of things. But it's more of a layers of gray rather than a black and white. You have to be one or the other.
Right.
That's not to say there's none of that. There are some people who have been deeply traumatized by the church that want nothing to do with Christianity. And when I have the opportunity to cross paths with them, I just spend most of my time listening and hearing their stories, because I realize that what I represent is a threat to their well-being because of the trauma that they've carried.
But which is very reasonable.
People, when they hear that I'm coming to the community as a pastor, they actually say, "We're glad you're here. We think that you play an important part of our community's well-being as we continue to recover from that history and pursue something new," which is nice to receive.
An interesting thing that is probably not good on the left is we often go, well, this thing that we did during the past 30 years, whatever, 50 years, I don't care, is very bad.
Sure.
For how the Christian and white community abused and colonized the First Nations. It's hundreds of years, right? But the thing that we don't recognize is that is now part of First Nations history. You can't just go back to how it was prior to the existence of the white man.
Right.
You can't. That's just not how it works. So it sounds to me, and you may confirm or deny this, that the First Nations community is going, okay, this is now a part of our history. This is how do we deal with this history? Because we can't get rid of it. How do we adopt it? How do we change it? How do we make it more compatible with who we truly are? And I think that's a much better solution. And my experience with the First Nations community is limited. But for example, I've been to many of the Every Child Matters protests, and it's always, I have never felt once in my life pushed away, because I'm a sixth generation Canadian, like our family's been here forever, right? And the community goes, well, no, you're as Canadian as I am. That's what my experience with the First Nations. They're very share alike.
Yes. And that's been how I've been received in general too.
Yeah.
That being said, so I recognize I am biased as a white man. I want to be received as I am. And I also see that part of the reason why the people in Curve Lake are the way they are is because they have been a little bit more integrated into the social structures of our region. Whereas I know even among Southern First Nations, sometimes that's not been their experience, and they have a little bit more of a contentious way of thinking about things. So somewhere like Hiawatha, for example, they are Mohawk. They pride themselves on being warriors, and they have a very active activist scene where they are much more likely to engage in confrontational forms of activism because of the fact that they think that colonialism still is very much part of our system. And I see that they're right in a lot of ways, right? And so I'm drawn towards the nice, moderate people who are willing to receive me and love me and say, yeah, you're part of a community.
Of course.
I also realize, but I should feel some more tension than I do sometimes in that, because I do realize that there's still this systemic injustice that disadvantages Native people in our society. By the way, I'm using the term Native. At my church, a lot of the people consume a lot of American media. And in the United States, of course, Native American is the dominant term. And so I was actually surprised. I tend to use First Nation or Indigenous to describe the people that I'm working with, because those are both more socially acceptable terms these days. But a lot of them refer to themselves as native, so often I default to that because that's in our church how people tend to talk, is we're native.
Yeah, I make mistakes about that too, so I apologize as well on that
No, but
front.
I just putting that out there in case anybody's hurt or offended
Yep.
by how the language I'm using.
Yes.
That's why I'm using it. It's
Thank
not
you for saying that.
intentional. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. So, Ben, I do not like ending interviews on sad notes or like doomer notes. There's always solutions. There are always solutions. And the question is, are we going to implement those solutions? What are the solutions to de-radicalize the right-wing evangelical bloc? How do we bring them back to an integration within society and within communities outside of that community? Because they need to interact with people beyond their own walls.
This cuts really close to my own sense of vocation.
Okay.
I recognize I have an opportunity that many people do not, because I am from the evangelical world and I am received by evangelicals as being one of their own. And yet, I also have my other foot outside of the evangelical world, working with younger generations who are not as entrenched in that mindset, and working with First Nations people who have been hurt by that mindset and seeing the challenges that have come with even the colonialism that exists in evangelicalism. And so I feel like I have, the analogy I use is if you imagine canoes floating in the water, I have one foot in each canoe. And our societal momentum is that those canoes want to drift apart. That group, the people in each of those different boats is trying to distance themselves from the other and even eliminate the other from society. Not most of the people I work directly with. The evangelicals I work with tend to be a little bit more moderate. The students and First Nations people that I work with tend to be a little more receptive to people like me. Nonetheless, the people in those groups feel the social pressure to go one way or the other, right? The moderate evangelicals feel like they should become less moderate. That's something I encounter all the time. And what I find my personal vocation is to try to the best of my ability to live in both of those identities, to live in both of those worlds, and then bridge the gap between people. To say to my evangelical friends, let me tell you the stories of the native people that I know and how our history has actually harmed them and why these changes are beneficial for them. And hopefully that softens their fear and their worry about the changes. They will see there is some good in this. And vice versa, when it comes to the people who are eager for the change and see the evangelicals as the enemy, I see it as important for me to say, well, let me tell you about what it's like to grow up in that fear mindset and to try and unpack all of that baggage that comes with it. Because that's not an easy process.
Identity.
It leaves you with an awful lot of cognitive dissonance, right? Mm-hmm. And as much as possible, I like to get those groups of people together and actually talking to each other. And again, I think this is one of the spaces the church can fill moving forward. This path of the peacemaker is people like me who bridge communities can do their best to actually understand and empathize with both sets of people and then try and cultivate that empathy and understanding. It doesn't change the need to acknowledge the social issues and to actually do justice. I think that's part of our calling. But I think the best path of justice is one where we can do it from a foundation of mutual understanding and a desire for everyone to flourish. And if we can do that, then we will achieve something like real justice, at least for a period of time, rather than it becoming just a new entrenched injustice, which is so often where the revolutionary impulse leads.
Right.
So I think communities of peacemaking and justice is something I'm committed to cultivating and living out in my own calling. And I encourage you, look for people that are doing that, be part of that as much as you are able to. And that is often a Christian thing, although it's not only a Christian thing. I see actually one of the things I love is many First Nations people are actually committed to that as well. And they try to create settings where settlers and Indigenous people can come together and hear each other's stories and learn about things and grow together. And I don't see that as competitive with my Christian peacemaking. I see that as part and parcel of the same desire to create peace. And that's what I think Jesus wanted us to pursue with like-minded individuals of every stripe.
What I was going to ask is, well, something that I think is challenging for almost everybody, probably you included, myself included, is you see the internet and everyone's freaking out on the internet, and then you talk to a person in
True that.
face to face, and you're like, "Wow, you're a very normal person." That's a common experience, I think.
Yes, it is.
But the other thing is, we get very trapped in this is what's happening right now, and we forget that 10 years, this is not what will be happening right now.
Yes.
And so, do you think that the long-term future is where you're focusing, and instead of the exact right now drama?
Yeah. In intercultural studies, they have this verbiage of a long view of time or a short view of time. And what's interesting is they have the opposite effect of what you think. A long view of time says the world is kind of as it always has been. And because of that, we don't have to be too concerned, too preoccupied with the now. We can be a little more relaxed about what's happening in the here and now. And so long view cultures, like most First Nations, tend to not worry too much about whether they're running late or sticking to the exact plan that you put forward. They tend to just have a more relaxed approach to things. Whereas a short view of time tends to say, no, we need to change the world now. And so everything is about the plan, the moment, the getting it done. And that is very much the way that our society tends to function, is the here and now is what matters. And that increases the urgency. Being around First Nations people has helped me to just relax, as they would say. So I think that's part of what's going on there, is I do have a longer view of time than I was raised with and that I naturally tend towards. Alongside that, I think that my experience has been that the most important parts of life are not the things that attracts the media attention. The most important parts of life are not what people are posting about on Facebook. The most important parts of life are the way that we love the kids in our families, whether that's our own children or our extended families or the communities around us, our neighborhoods. What matters most is when people get together and eat together and share in life together and treat each other as deserving of attention. And I think a lot of that stuff continues underneath the surface of our society. And if we can only unplug a little from the social media, or if we can only bring some of those traits into our interaction with other people online, that tends to have a staying power that the other stuff doesn't. The people who have changed my life are the people who invested in me relationally, not the people who taught something on a YouTube video. And I think that is the path to a flourishing society.
That's it. Benjamin and I continued to talk for a long while afterwards. We talked for nearly an hour and a half about his work in the Indigenous communities and the culture there. But I felt it would do us better to have someone from Quebec First Nations to speak for themselves. I felt thoughtful after this, wondering about my own role in lifting up politics as a sort of new religion, and I realized that in Quebec, we're less separated from the country than I thought. With that, please check out the Rovers website, like and subscribe, and enjoy all the work we're doing right now. Link below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.